Thank you, Jonathan. Yes. Oh, there we go. So it sounds like it's important for those that are working in a peer role to understand that taking care of themselves and maintaining good care for their own recovery can help them to fulfill those roles within the agency that they're working at or within their peer role at an agency. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So, another question. What do you know now about your role as a peer on an FEP team that maybe you wished you knew before you got started, or information, I guess, that you wish you had before you got started?
I think one of the things about a peer on a coordinated specialty care team that's a little bit different, maybe from other like sort of peer support environments, is that you're working with a team of clinicians, and so it's a tremendous advantage in some ways, like to promote like my own learning and stuff like that. But I've also noticed like there's like this idea that Pat Deegan kind of encapsulated about like peer drift, and sometimes it's easy to kind of drift into like a junior clinician role, like taking on like the language of a clinician rather than like an authentic like peer language. And so I think it's really important with regards to that, to have my own connections with other peer supporters and also to be connected to the recovery community that helped me get to where I am today. Like the support groups and meetings and stuff like that that help like me like in my own therapy and stuff. And so like all that kind of like coming back to that whole idea of like self-care and stuff like that, having like my own channels for my own recovery so that I'm not just kind of co-opting the language of clinicians or sort of drifting into their model of thinking. The other thing is too is like with regards to drift, I think it's also easy to drift into kind of almost like a friendship role with the person that I'm supporting. And I think peer support is radically different than just friendship. I mean, I think there's a component where you're friendly with a person, like you want to have that bond, but but the role of a peer support is still different. We bill for our time, we write progress notes. It's not really like a friendship that they might meet in the community. So I think just to set that concept of drifting into different roles that maybe aren't an authentic peer role is what I kind of wish I had known. That it's almost like being out in the ocean and you find yourself like the water is pulling you in a certain direction, and it's easy to get pulled, in different directions, and it's important to maintain those boundaries and like, what is my lane on the team? What is my lane, with the participant, and what is my own lane with my own recovery too, and not allowing some of those things to mix, too much.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. I know one of the things that I hear sometimes from peers is and you kind of touched on that, is the struggle of, my journey being my journey and not pushing on maybe what worked well for me or what helped me in my journey and not pushing that on to maybe a participant or somebody that they're working with. What might be some thoughts with that? Like if a peer came to you and asked you, how can I safeguard, not pushing what worked well for me onto this person that I'm working with?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, with respect to that, like, just to kind of take an example, like I'm a person with a substance use disorder, in addition to having a psychotic disorder, and not everyone that in on a first treatment FEP treatment participant has that co-occurring disorder. They might just have the psychotic disorder, and so there's been a couple participants that might be prescribed stimulants, and I'm thinking like in the back of my mind, like, oh, like that'd be like I cannot do that. I cannot take like a stimulant and be okay with that, like in my recovery. But like for them, it's like it helps them like get out of bed. It helps them stay focused on tasks, and the doctor like recommended it for their treatment, and so I think it's just important, like in situations like that, to be able to like take a step back and be like, okay, like as peer support specialists, one of the ideas is that we embrace multiple pathways of recovery. Like for me, a stimulant might not be like in my order prescription order, but for someone else, it could very well be. And similarly, like for someone maybe like NAMI is like where they find their network, and maybe for me it's like a 12-step fellowship, or or vice versa, and or maybe somebody doesn't even want to go to like a 12-step fellowship or a support group. They just like to meet with me individually. Um, there's different aspects of the community where you can find support that might, it's not like a one size fits all, like in recovery. Like people have their own niche in recovery and their own like dynamic in terms of like what they find worked for them.
Awesome, awesome, Jonathan. Thank you. So over the course of your career, how have you seen the role of being a peer evolve, either just in terms of the profession peer or being a peer on a CSC for FEP team?
Sure. So as the role has evolved, I think we've gotten more credibility over time. I think when I first came 6 years ago onto the team at Catholic Charities, I think there was a little bit like maybe some of the staff were kind of like, who is this guy, and is he going to be taking our job or taking our clients? Like, I think there was some kind of like guardedness a little bit, and I feel like that's kind of relaxed over. Maybe it's just me, maybe becoming more familiar with where how I fit in too, but I think I've also felt like my colleagues have kind of like lowered their guard a little bit and like seen like the benefit of what it means to have someone with lived experience and like how that lived experience can be channeled like on the team in an effective way.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah. An interesting question here, just in terms of how, when you're working with a participant that's part of a CSC for FEP program, and maybe they're talking with you, and they may say to you, "Hey, Jonathan, I'm going to tell you something, but I really don't want you to tell my therapist, or I really don't want you to tell the nurse practitioner, or the psychiatrist. This is just between you and I." How would you handle a situation like that, or what approach do you take when that comes up?
Sure. So it has come up from time to time. Sometimes participants are surprised when information gets relayed, and I think it'd be good for me maybe to have something in when I am first introduced to the service that that just a reminder. We do share information. We are part of your treatment team, and we all work together as a team. I don't always share that initially, but I think that would be a good practice for me to start doing that more often, just at the get go. And I think it is important to recognize that, I do write progress notes, and sometimes I will remind them of that. I do write progress notes; they're documented. I'm not just kind of operating willy nilly in these sessions. Like I do have to be accountable for the time that I'm meeting with you, and so I also work on as a part of your treatment team, not your whole treatment team. And so we share the information that we receive. And then I think lastly, just the thing about being like a mandated reporter, I think that's something that's not always known, is that peer support specialists are mandated reporters as well. And so similar to other mental health professionals, if there is someone that has duty to harm self or others, or is at risk to harm self or others, that I have a duty to disclose that information to the treatment team, to my superiors, to try to get them access to care that would maybe intervene in such a situation. So I have to disclose that information kind of preeminently. I can't just hold that in.
Thank you, Jonathan. So one role of being a peer support specialist is to bring the voice of lived experience to the team, the CSC for FEP team that you're working on. How do you do that? And then a kind of a second part to that question is, are there challenges that you've experienced related to doing that?
Sure. Another good question. So yes, I think the most important thing is just like the way I carry myself. Like I think people there was there was a saying that when I was first being treated for a substance use disorder, one of the counselors said, you might be the only big book like recovery literature that somebody reads, and so I think like that's important. Like I'm modeling recovery for my coworkers, just like I'm modeling recovery for the participants. So the way I carry myself is really important. Like they might, if I'm flying off the handle like emotionally or not being professional, that kind of is like a judgment on all people with psychotic conditions, or they might form like an idea, oh, maybe these peer support specialists don't really have a place, at the table. Maybe this is the wrong idea, and so like how I carry myself is really important. Then also like how I write notes. Like I try to write notes. Like I'm not always like the best about this, but when I'm writing notes, sometimes I try to write notes just from like the perspective of like humanizing the participant. Like hey, this is like a human being that we're talking about, like that has their own like dreams, their own like fears, like their own anxieties. Like how can I make like a note that actually like documents like their humanity rather than just like their symptoms or like their problems or the like the trouble in their life, you know. So I try to like sometimes put like a little touch like that on my note, like like hey, this is a human being that we're talking about. And then the other idea too is that I don't really have like graphs or like figures to like back up like the things that I say. What I really have is just like memories, emotions, and sometimes even like wounds and stuff too. Like I'm kind of reluctant to say trauma, but like I think like just the experience of going through psychosis, there were elements maybe that were traumatic. Just having that, and so this is kind of getting back to that aspect of self care where I think like my continued work and recovery is really important. I still have like a therapist that I meet with. I still take medications like to treat my own psychosis from to keep it at bay. And I still have like a support group and a psychiatrist that I meet with. And like having like those things like allows me like to keep like sometimes the most important work that I'm doing is really just like that self care so that I can be like an open ear or like a solid resource for the participant that I'm working with. And so that my mess doesn't get spilled over into their life, like so that I can keep like that, from interfering with my ability to provide help to them.
And I think for people that maybe you're meeting with, Jonathan, it helps them to hear that, you know, you, despite the progress that you've made, it is a journey, continues to be a journey, and continuing to work on yourself is of vital importance. And so I think that's good for them to hear that as well. So, how about in your work as a peer? Any particularly impactful treatment experiences, like quote unquote success stories, that you would feel comfortable sharing or talking about?
Sure. Yes, I'd be happy to. So one is a young man that's doing really well right now, and he's been out of the hospital for like the last few years, and there was a period of time where he was in and out of the hospital kind of regularly, and really struggled with the idea of like being on medicine and like taking medicine. And I think the treatment team had tried different medicines, and they kind of like all like kind of like just didn't really sit well with him, and eventually he got on a medicine that he was able to tolerate, but it had a noticeable side effect. And we used to go on like recovery walks, like where we would walk around the neighborhood and like talk about different things that inspired him, and vice versa, and share experience, strength, and hope. Um and but there was one day like where we were in the metro parks, and like all his like muscles locked up in his legs, and like he could not walk. And I had to call like an Uber to pick him up and to like take him back to like his home because his muscles were like locked up. And like um when we like told his family about it, like they were like, oh no, he's like making this up, like um it's he just doesn't want to take the medicine, don't you get it? Like, and so like I had similar, it's actually like a documented side effect of some antipsychotics that can create that experience. And like I had a similar thing happen to me like when I was on antipsychotics. So like, and I still take an antipsychotic, but there's some like that just don't sit well with me. And there was one that would lock up my body too, just like for him. And so I knew that he wasn't making the thing up, and so I was able to like advocate to him, to his family, and say, hey, no, he's not. This isn't like fraudulent. This is really what's going on. And then I was able to talk to the treatment team, and we got him before the psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist was aware of the condition and was able to prescribe like a counteracting medication to prevent that from happening. And eventually, like this participant ended up taking it, and he's holding down a job now. He's doing really well at his job. He's considering like starting his own company. He's been out of the hospital for years now, and he's a delight to be around. I mean, he really like for me, it's like he's one of like just like the anchors of the peer support group that all the other guys like kind of look for a mature voice and stuff like that. It's been really a pleasure to work with him.
Wow, and thank you for sharing that because I think about without that advocacy, without you being able to help advocate for him in that time, how that journey may have ended up different if you weren't there to be that voice. So awesome. Thank you for sharing that. Um, so a lot of different providers here with us in the FEP Echo. Some of them may be thinking, you know what, this having a peer on our team might be a really good idea. I'm going to go talk to my leadership about bringing a peer onto our CSC for FEP team. What would be some feedback? What would be some suggestions for them to take to their leadership about the benefits of incorporating peer recovery supports on the CSC for FEP team?
Well, I think one of the important roles that I play is just like being a bridge. And I think that a peer support specialist can really connect between like the therapist and the psychiatrist and naturally like someone, I think sometimes it's easy to underestimate kind of like the daunting feeling of like going into a psychiatrist and like saying like, hey, like, some people say I have this condition, or maybe like even you're telling me that I have this condition, and I don't know if I really believe that I have this condition or that I even want to address this condition. And I think like a peer support specialist can be like a real bridge, like in like being like, hey, like you don't have to be like stigmatized by this thing. Like it's not the end of your life. Like this thing can be treated, and like I'm living proof of it. And I think that like that can like lower like the barriers, like they kind of like, or even like the stigma, and kind of like help them to feel like, hey, they're not alone in this, and they don't have to be intimidated by their clinician or their psychiatrist, or like I think sometimes it can be like intimidating to go before the doctor and just be like, hey, like I'm gonna try these medicines that you're telling me to try, and having like a guide like that has already been through it, like can be like a vital stage in their recovery, and a vital like resource to help them get back on their feet and have like the wherewithal to like to face the challenge that is recovery.
Awesome, Jonathan. Thank you. Yeah, I think about that all important voice in circumstances for providers on teams to hear, and bringing that the peer perspective. I think being so important. We want to be mindful of our time here, and I'm sure that we could go on and ask Jonathan questions for the rest of the afternoon. But I got to make sure we keep it moving. And so I want to thank you, Jonathan, for the presentation last month, your willingness and openness to answer questions and sharing your journey with everyone here today. It's so valuable to hear those experiences. And so I just want to express, I'll speak for everybody here in the community, our gratitude for your willingness to do so. And so very much appreciated. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah. We will.